of Gaza Strip. The new wave of airstrikes, according to reports coming in from Gaza, has resulted in 400 fatalities in a single day. And some reports seem to indicate that not only have more than 400 people died, the number of injured is more than 500 in the Israeli strikes, renewed Israeli strikes amidst that very fragile ceasefire that was in place. But that's not all. Israel has now directed people living in the northern and the eastern part of Gaza Strip to vacate the area. They were just returning home. Shattered homes during Ramzan. People were just returning, but now they've been directed to leave once again and move to the central part of the Gaza Strip. And very clearly the fragile ceasefire shattered with the latest bombing in the holy month of Ramzan, according to reports that are coming in. And we will show you the impact of the airstrikes in Gaza, or reports that are coming in. Gazans had returned to their shattered homes. Reports from ground indicate that hospitals that were working barely with enough essentials are already under stress. I'm Gaurav Sawant. We get you much more on this big story. Also, the conversation between US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin, it's been on for close to 2 hours. Is there a glimmer of hope? Dare we hope that peace will come between Russia and Ukraine, and at least that battlefield will not see more than 2,500 casualties every week? I'll get you both the stories. First, as always, the headlines. A day after violence in Nagpur over Aurangzeb, Chief Minister Devendra Fadnavis hints that the riots were a pre-planned conspiracy. More than 50 rioters have been arrested. Opposition claims that the government failed to maintain law and order. Prime Minister Narendra Modi lauds the Mahakumbh success in Parliament. Opposition hits back. Samajwadi Party asks why no mention of stampede deaths. Rahul Gandhi claims he wasn't permitted to speak in the House. Enforcement Directorate heat on George Soros-linked companies in India. Open Society Foundation affiliates raided. Forex violation probed by Enforcement Directorate on Soros-linked firms. The Director of US National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, praises Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Says, like the US President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Modi committed to nation first. Ends her speech with Aloha and Jai Shri Krishna chant. Astronaut Sunita Williams finally earthbound. SpaceX Falcon undocks from the International Space Station. Splashdown on Earth expected at 3:27 a.m. IST. India Today will be live to get you the latest. Our top story are the mass casualties that are being reported from Gaza after Israel carried out a series of airstrikes in Gaza Strip. This new wave of strikes has resulted, according to reports from Gaza, in more than 400 fatalities and more than 500 injuries. But that's not all. Israel has directed people in this part of the Gaza Strip to vacate the area and move south, move towards the central part of the Gaza Strip. And this is the holy month of Ramzan. People had barely returned home during the fragile ceasefire when the bombing raid resulted not only in many families being impacted and adversely impacted, several killed, but many now being forced to leave once again. Now, reports from ground seem to suggest that hospitals that were barely working with essentials are already under stress. There's a shortage that's being reported of fuel and essential medicines. Of course, Israel has contested this, saying relief supplies were in place enough to stock up. Israel has asked people to shift towards the central part of the country. What's alarming for Gaza is that information trickling in, operations are not only open-ended, but they could expand in the coming days and weeks. Israel has directed people to evacuate. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly told his officials, and this is something that's being echoed by Israel's diplomats globally, that no mercy will be shown to Hamas as long as hostages remain in Gaza. This renewed offensive will be halted only when the Israeli hostages are returned and there's a deal that's reached on the timeline of the return of the remaining hostages in the custody of Hamas. Reports also suggest that Israel had informed the United States about this operation. Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz has been quoted saying the attacks were renewed due to Hamas' refusal to release the remaining hostages. And that's just one part of the story. He's also said that there was a threat to harm IDF soldiers, that's the Israeli Defense Forces, and also Israeli civilians living in the border area. We have a reaction from Israel's ambassador to India, Ambassador Reuven Azar. Let's quickly listen in. I'll get you more on that story.
We have managed to bring back 195 hostages out of 245. There are still 59 hostages that are left in the Gaza Strip. About half of them are alive, and we are determined to bring them back. If Hamas refuses to do so, they will face Israeli attacks because they are refusing to engage in diplomacy. They are stubborn to create a situation in which, in return of the hostages, they keep their grip on the Gaza Strip. And this is refused not only by Israel, also by the United States. There is zero distance between Israel and the United States in this matter, and I'm sure that many countries in the region, pragmatic countries that want to engage in peaceful activity, they are against Hamas as well. So if they don't renounce power, it means that hostilities will continue.
I quickly want to cut across to India Today's Foreign Affairs editor Geeta Mohan joining us with the latest on this big story. Also with me is Professor Brahma Chilani, a very well-respected analyst of security situation in this region and of course across the world. But I want to bring in Geeta Mohan first. Geeta, what more can you tell us about the strikes and this sudden escalation during this very fragile ceasefire that was or is in place? Hardly any ceasefire with more than 400 dead, Geeta.
Well, this certainly is not a ceasefire anymore. Israel has upped the ante and escalated matters at a time when we do know that there is massive support that is coming Israel's way from the United States of America, Gaurav. And while there is an entire conversation on how will this entire issue be resolved, there's also a growing voice from Washington, D.C. that speaks of no two-state solution, that there can be no Palestine, a separate state for Palestine or Palestinians. I was just interviewing James Caravan from the Heritage Foundation, very close to the Trump administration, and he very clearly has said that the Palestinians will have to be removed there for peace to prevail, and that there cannot be a separate state for Palestine. So that's a position that has been taken, and you will see that more so coming from Washington, D.C., from official quarters on the situation on the ground. The reading is what Israel is saying and what Israel is sending back as dispatches to Washington, D.C., that the threat to Israel is real, it's serious, and that's why the actions that have been taken are preventive in nature. But at this moment, this is a huge, can't say violation because there is no ceasefire anymore. But the action is massive escalation.
This does appear to be huge escalation. And Geeta, stay with me. Let me bring in Professor Brahma Chilani for more on this. We will focus on the conversation between President Trump and President Putin in just a moment. But before that, this big story, Professor Chilani, how do you view this? And Geeta just telling us that the Trump administration is on board. President Donald Trump had also spoken of people in Gaza Strip moving away from this region. Now, do you see that part of the plan unfolding with this airstrike, with people being asked to move to the central part of Gaza? Ultimately, will they be told to move south and continue moving south?
That's an interesting question. But look at the paradox, Gaurav. On one side, Trump is pushing for peace in Ukraine. He's right now talking to Putin. And on the other side, we have Trump giving approval to Israel to renew war in Gaza. Israel, of course, faces a terrible security situation. In fact, faces an existential crisis. But the problem is that over the decades, Israeli decision makers, instead of focusing on long-term strategic success, have focused on short-term tactical gains. So one wonders whether the latest strikes in Gaza by Israel have been driven by the desire for short-term tactical gains, because short-term tactical gains are not going to advance Israel's security. The focus on speedy victory, or the focus on showing to the people in Israel that the government is able to do things in a spectacular manner, that kind of focus tends to detract from underpinning Israel's long-term security.
Absolutely. Professor Chilani, stay with me. There's breaking news coming in. We are learning from the White House that US President Donald Trump's conversation with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, those talks have just concluded. The Trump-Putin conversation lasted more than 2.5 hours. That's the information that's coming in. White House says President Trump and President Putin spoke as US seeks Russia to sign off on a plan to end the war against a very skeptical Ukraine, or if I may, at least have a ceasefire in place. We are also being joined by Xenia Kondrateva, joining us on this broadcast, editor RT. Joining us on this broadcast also with us is Donald Kauta, RT correspondent, joining us from Moscow in just a moment. But once again, I want to quickly cut across to Geeta Mohan. Geeta, any word coming in? Initially, the White House had indicated talks were being held in a positive environment and they were moving in a positive direction. Any more word coming in from the White House or from Russia on what transpired?
Well, the information that's coming in is that the conversation that's the information that's coming in. It's a long conversation. It's unprecedented. We've seen conversations in the past, but none of them last more than 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Some go on for maybe half an hour, but 2.5 hours is a long time. And we're looking at a conversation where President Trump wanted to speak about a truce. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, in a conversation yesterday, said that all issues, current issues, will be on the agenda. So we'll have to wait and see what are the details of the conversation that took place between President Trump and President Putin. But for now, it's a long conversation. I'm sure the thrust and the most important area of conversation over here was the truce or the peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. There were a few conditions that were laid by Russia, and that certainly had to do with no foreign forces in Ukraine, avowing to not join NATO ever, that NATO cannot be a part of the conversations. But it's what would be more interesting, Gaurav, in this conversation, but once details come out, is what did President Trump really have to offer in terms of negotiations and
that's the big question. Let me quickly cut across to Moscow. Geeta, we have Donald Kauta joining us on the broadcast. Donald, welcome. What can you tell us from the Moscow studio of RT? Any word from Kremlin just as yet?
Well, the phone conversation had lasted a long time, but Vladimir Putin has concluded the conversation with Donald Trump, according to the Kremlin, according to its spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. He spoke to TASS, Russia's media agency, and the White House also told NBC that the call has ended. But, we're still waiting on specifics of what exactly was discussed in this meeting. But Trump is expected to give some sort of press conference after this. It could be that Putin is ready to do the same as well. But in terms of what's expected, what has been expected to be talked about during this phone call, of course, it's the ceasefire, the temporary 30-day ceasefire that the U.S. agreed with Ukraine in Jeddah last week, and which has been trying to get Russia to agree to as well. Putin said he agrees in principle, but there are a number of moments that have to be gone over as well. Of course, Russia doesn't want a temporary ceasefire where Ukraine is going to use that time just to rearm, continue its mobilization, continue beefing up its front lines just for 30 days to end, and then for them to go back to war with Russia. So we're going to have to, new details are coming in minute by minute, so we're going to have to wait and see what both leaders are probably going to say at press conferences after this call, because it just ended like 10 minutes ago.
And stay with me. Let me also bring in Xenia Kondrateva for more on this. And Xenia, Russia's red lines, as Donald was telling us, are very, very clear. They do not want Ukraine to use these 30 days to regroup, rearm, retrain, and then relaunch attacks against Russia. But how are those guarantees likely to be kept? What guarantees is Russia seeking?
Well, that's a $1 million question, because Russia has been clear that no NATO peacekeeping or European peacekeeping troops would be acceptable to it. And in fact, today, as I'm speaking to you from Delhi, here at Raisina Dialogue, we had those discussions with U.S. and European officials and experts debating how actually the proposed ceasefire could be monitored. I don't think there was a clarity on that as of now.
That's extremely interesting, because these 30 days, Professor Chilani, one, how will that ceasefire be maintained? Two, how does Russia ensure that Ukraine is not armed either by the US or, more importantly, US may not, but European counterparts? Europe is talking about arming Ukraine, providing even troops on ground, whether it's for peacekeeping or other purposes. Those Russian concerns, any word, how is that likely to be addressed, sir?
Well, Russia is making advances on the battlefield. It has momentum in its favor. So any kind of temporary ceasefire will stall that momentum. It'll work to Russia's disadvantage militarily, not diplomatically, but militarily for certain. But Trump has invested political capital in bringing an end to hostilities in Ukraine. He may be seeking more than a 30-day ceasefire. He may be seeking something, he might be seeking a temporary ceasefire as a step toward enduring peace. I think that probably is his goal. And he wants an end to hostilities within his first 100 days in office. So I don't expect an announcement to be made immediately that Russia has agreed to a ceasefire. But I think in the coming weeks, there will be a lot of pressure on Putin to accept an end to hostilities, an end to this fighting. And it's not just for Russia's sake or for Ukraine's sake. It's for America's sake too. We tend to forget, as if Trump is doing it for the good of the world, as he to use his own words. He's doing it for the good of America. He's doing it to cut America's losses and to shift strategic focus from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, where America's real enemy, China, is located.
Oh, absolutely. One of his efforts also perhaps would be, and that's something that we will discuss maybe a little later, is to wean Russia away from China's or dragon stranglehold, as many in the West describe it. But Donald, is there clarity whether it's an off-the-record conversations with Kremlin or on-record conversations with Kremlin on what happens to territory that Russia has in its control, apart from Donetsk and Luhansk, Zaporozhye, for example?
Well, in terms of what the United States has said, we've already seen officials from the Trump administration saying that Ukraine is going to have to come to terms with the fact that it's not going to return its borders to pre-2014 levels. They claim to have Crimea, to have Lugansk and Donetsk. These are places that have been essentially completely integrated into Russia. And as your other guest mentioned, Russia's making serious advances on the battlefield, right? So, of course, the ceasefire, if it doesn't meet Russia's goals in the military operation, it's not going to be beneficial for Moscow at all. And so, Russia's not going to settle for anything less than international recognition of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, all places that voted to become part of the Russian Federation. Putin's not going to settle for anything less than international recognition of that, especially when he's got the upper hand on the battlefield. And the Trump administration has basically told Zelensky that that's a reality he's going to have to come to terms with.
Okay, and that will be extremely difficult for President Zelensky to come to terms with and sell it to his people and not be seen as perhaps a sellout or a complete surrender. But what's the situation, the factual situation in Kursk, and what are Russia's red lines in this conversation, Donald, before I bring in Xenia?
Well, one of the main things that Putin said with regard to this, after we saw Steve Witkoff come to Russia to present this ceasefire proposal, the Ukrainian forces in Kursk that are now surrounded were discussed, and Trump, of course, had pleaded with Vladimir Putin to spare their lives. Vladimir Putin said that he's ready to do that if those Ukrainian soldiers lay down their arms and surrender. They'll be treated in accordance with international law. Again, we have to remember that Russia just launched a super effective pipeline surprise offensive against the Ukrainian forces in Kursk that have basically annihilated Ukrainian positions in most of the region. And so we're still waiting on if Zelensky is going to give an order to those troops to surrender and lay down their arms, because if they don't, Vladimir Putin recently said time's running out and the Russian offensive will continue.
So, Xenia, when we look at the situation right now, because on India Today, we get you all sides of the story. We're getting you the Russian perspective, the American perspective, the Ukrainian perspective, also so that we know there's forward movement. But in your conversations and the way we are seeing Europe and America don't appear to be on the same page. Is that an apprehension for Russia? Europe will continue to arm Ukraine?
Well, definitely that's what we hear from the European leaders, from the European speakers. That was my personal experience today. As we heard Europeans speak at the Raisina Forum, that they see Russia as a threat and that they support Ukraine. They also see what is important here. They see Russia as weak, which is probably does not really correspond with the reality. And not just talking about the situation on the battlefield, but economically. I think Europeans, and that's what the expert community is discussing, that the Europeans is probably still living in sort of a bubble and have sort of a cliche mentality when it comes to Russia. And it will be difficult, I mean, for real peace talks, for real peace negotiations on Ukraine to proceed, that probably has to change.
And Professor Chilani, if I may, are Europe and America then working at cross purposes? America wants peace. Donald Trump wants to show he's been able to achieve that peace, even if it's respite for a month. Europe is talking about arming Ukraine all the way till the end. Merit in Xenia Kondrateva saying that Europe perceives Russia to be weak, not just militarily on ground, but economically and politically isolated, except, of course, having support of countries like China.
You're right, Gaurav. It's the split between the US and its European allies, including the UK and France, over the future of the war that is roiling international relations. The rift could transform the transatlantic alliance. And the irony is this, that Europe doesn't lack economic power. It's a powerhouse, economic powerhouse. Yet it depends on the US for its own security. So how can Europe on its own seek to prop up Ukraine? This is the paradox that Europe faces. But the good news is this, that diplomacy is back in action. Diplomacy between adversaries is crucial to diffuse tensions and prevent direct conflict. But Joe Biden firmly shut the door to diplomacy with Russia, prolonging Ukraine's suffering. Today, we are seeing how diplomacy has raised hopes of a ceasefire, hopes of an end to this vicious war. But I think there's a larger element to this, which is that
Yes.
if you look at Ukraine's choices, Ukraine has been on a losing streak. Its counteroffensive in 2023 failed. Its incursion into Kursk has recently failed or unraveled.
Yes.
It has lost about 1/5 of its territory to Russia. So the choice before Ukraine is either to continue on the present path, that is, continue on its losing streak, or to cut its losses. If it were to cut its losses and agree to end hostilities with Russia, it'll be able to recoup its losses and emerge stronger eventually.
You're absolutely right, Professor Chilani, and we will track developments on this story very, very closely. Donald Kauta, Xenia Kontrateva, and Professor Brahma Chilani for joining me here on this India Today special broadcast. Many thanks. Don't go anywhere. We're slipping into a break, but on the other side, astronaut Sunita Williams is coming home. She is going to land on Earth. The splashdown is likely at 3:27 a.m. More about the journey, the celebrations, the anticipation, and the apprehensions. All of that coming up on India Today. Stay with us.